Before there were wraiths upon the wind, before the black banners of fear rode out from Mordor, there were kings. They were not born in shadow, nor raised in whispers, but in the broad daylight of realms that looked to them for shelter and direction. These were men of stature and renown, their names spoken with reverence in courts and marketplaces alike, their hands raised in oath to defend lands that were still finding shape after the long ruin of Númenor's fall. To imagine the Nazgûl only as phantoms is to forget that once they were flesh and voice, that once they bore crowns wrought in gold and silver, and that their thrones stood high over cities filled with song. The tale begins there among kingdoms that flourished with ambition and fragile pride, where the gift of 9 rings came not as a threat, but as a promise. The age was young, though already scarred by strife. In hidden forges deep within the land of Eregion, the rings of power had been wrought under fair counsel, though not all counsel was free of deceit. The elves received their 7 and 3, yet it was the 9 destined for men that would shape a shadow longer than any tower. For Sauron, cloaked then in fair disguise, knew the hearts of men better than they knew themselves. He knew their longing for endurance, their hunger to outlast time and decay, their restless desire to see their empires endure beyond their Rhee's mortal span. So he placed before them gifts that answered precisely what they craved. One by one the kings accepted. There was no single ceremony, no hall where all 9 gathered. Rather, across the far corners of Middle-earth, emissaries came bearing bands of gold and iron, each glimmering with an otherworldly sheen. Inkand, a warlord whose spears had subdued the plains, received his ring in the glare of his army's adoration. In Harad, a monarch beneath the red sun took his ring with solemnity, whispering that now his line would endure forever. In the north, beyond the misty mountains, lords who watched the darkening forests laid ringed hands upon their swords and swore their thrones unassailable. Even among the remnants of Númenorian lineage in Middle-earth, pride stirred, and kings bent beneath the temptation of a promise that mortality itself could be resisted. At first, there was splendor. The rings were not barren tokens. They bore real strength, real glamour, and their wearers felt it pulse through them like a second heart. Armies rallied more swiftly beneath their banners. Councils of rivals fell silent when they spoke. Their lifespans stretched, seasons passing while their faces remained unweathered by age. To subjects who lived brief, fragile lives, their rulers seemed half-dead, and so the covenant deepened. Kings who had once feared the brevity of their rule now believed they stood on the threshold of eternal dominion. Yet gifts of such weight are never unbound. Each ring carried within it a tether, a subtle cord drawn back to the one ring, the master band wrought in secret fire. Though the 9 did not know it, every triumph they enjoyed was already entered into another's account. When their hands closed about the hilts of their swords, they closed also about unseen chains. The rings were not merely adornments or amplifiers of strength. They were vessels of will, and in them the will of Sauron whispered ceaselessly, though soft enough at first to be mistaken for their own ambition. Time passed, and with it came rumors. Subjects spoke in hushed tones of kings who lingered unchanged across decades, whose eyes gleamed as if lit from behind by an alien flame. Markets grew silent when their rulers walked through them, for though the people bowed deeper than before, they did so with unease. There is reverence in awe, but there is fear in strangeness, and soon reverence was mingled with dread. Still, no throne toppled, for dominion seemed unshakable, and what realm dares turn against a sovereign who promises to outlast all rivals? The 9 themselves felt no urgency to question. When rivers of prosperity flowed, when borders widened, when their enemies faltered before their gaze, why should they doubt? Power convinces by its very operation, persuading its bearer that strength is proof of rightness. Yet in dreams, when the halls were quiet and the crown lay heavy on the brow, some stirred with unease. They saw not their own faces in the mirror, but veils of mist where once was flesh. They heard voices behind their thoughts, as though counsel came unbidden from the shadows. They told themselves it was only weariness or the consequence of burden, and yet the longer they held the rings, the more the burden became indistinguishable from themselves. What was a crown to a man who no longer aged? What was a kingdom to one who had begun to measure time in centuries rather than years? The balance shifted, though quietly, imperceptibly. The kings were no longer lords who wore rings. They were rings that wore lords. The adornments had ceased to be possessions and had become identities, binding flesh to fate. Still, outwardly, glory shone. Their courts echoed with victory feasts. Their walls gleamed with new conquests, and their banners stretched ever further into wild lands. The shadow was patient, and patience is the deepest cruelty of all. When whispers of unease reached the far west, the wise grew wary. Elves who had touched the making of rings knew too well that such gifts could not be trusted. They murmured of hidden snares, of bonds too deeply laid to be broken. But to men who felt their king's power as tangible proof, such warnings sounded like envy. Who among mortals would turn from a path that promised endurance, authority, and glory unfading? Even among the nine themselves, doubt was smothered by the sweet intoxication of triumph. It is hard to refuse a poison when it is blended with wine. Thus the stage was set. In time, these kings would no longer be remembered for their realms, their victories, or even their names. They would be remembered only as the Nine, the Nazgûl, the Ringwraiths, whose crowns dissolved into shadows and whose voices became cries of terror on the wind. But that end lay still ahead, veiled and waiting. For now they stood as sovereigns, bearing rings that gleamed by torchlight, believing themselves masters of their fate. Yet already beyond their halls, the dark tower stirred, and the gaze that had never left them watched with patient certainty. What invisible thread bound those nine crowns to shadow, and how would it tighten until flesh itself was undone? The answer waits in the nature of the power they accepted, and the hidden cost that no triumph could escape. The crowns had been claimed, the rings admired, and the nine reigned with new certainty. Yet the gift was never simple. To understand what bound them, one must pause upon the nature of power itself. For in Middle-earth, power is not merely the ability to command armies or build strongholds. It is woven in subtler ways, through pacts unseen, through channels that braid will and matter, spirit and stone. The rings of power were not trinkets of gold or ornaments for display. They were vessels that carried intention, each curve and inscription sealing into metal a fragment of purpose too deep to measure with mortal senses. And those purposes were not wholly their own. The elves had once believed they could master craft to preserve what they loved, bending the flow of time into circles that would not fade. The dwarves had trusted their rings to deepen their hoards, to strengthen their halls against ruin. Yet both had learned, or would learn, that gifts from Sauron carried in them a slant of will that turned every desire back toward him. For men the peril was greater, for their lives were shorter, their longing sharper, their ambition less tempered by ages of reflection. The nine were thus not merely recipients of beautiful tokens, they became partners in a covenant they never signed, drawn into a current that carried them toward shores they could not yet glimpse. At first, the working of the rings seemed no more than amplification. What a king desired in his heart, the ring made more immediate, more tangible. If he longed for victory, his armies found sudden fortune. If he sought the loyalty of his council, their voices faltered in dissent. If he dreamed of his line enduring, the ring seemed to whisper that his name would outlast centuries. The mechanism was subtle, for it answered honesty enough to satisfy, yet beneath the answers was a hidden arithmetic. Every triumph was not freely granted, but purchased with a coin unseen, its cost postponed into a future where it would be demanded without mercy. To wear such a ring was to step into another atmosphere, though at first the kings did not perceive it. Their senses sharpened strangely. They felt the breath of fear in men before a word was spoken. They perceived the doubts of rivals before they could be voiced. It seemed to them that their wisdom had grown vast, that foresight now shimmered at the edge of every thought. Yet this too was not clean sight, but vision tinted through another's gaze. The more they leaned upon it, the less they could distinguish their own judgment from the weight of the unseen. There is in Tolkien's world a law unspoken, that no power comes without its tether, that every gift drags behind it a shadow. The nine discovered this slowly. At feasts, when goblets were raised and songs filled the air, their mirth felt less genuine, as if hollowed by an echo. In solitude, when they sought counsel with themselves, they found whispers threading into thought, as if another mind breathed just beyond the veil. They told themselves it was the burden of rule, the strain of dominion carried too long. But in truth, the rings were doing what they were meant to do, drawing their bearers into the field of Sauron's will, knitting them into his web strand by strand. The elves, wary and watchful, perceived this before the kings themselves. They understood that the rings of men lacked the shields the three elven rings still retained. For the nine, there was no defense against intrusion, no barrier to the slow seep of domination. Sauron had poured more of his essence into these rings, more of his malice, more of his authority, for he knew that the hearts of men were the most malleable. The nine could resist at first, but each use deepened the channel, like water carving stone, until resistance itself became the shape of surrender. Subjects of the nine began to notice changes. Their lords, once decisive, grew strangely withdrawn when great matters pressed. At times they acted with a clarity that startled, issuing commands with voices that brooked no dispute. At other times they lingered in long silences, their eyes fixed upon distances unseen. The people said it was wisdom. The counselors whispered it was wariness, yet none dared to name it for what it was, a creeping alignment of one will with another, a convergence that would leave no space for the man who once was king. Still, the glory of the rings masked suspicion, for as the nine lingered in their strange duality, their kingdoms flourished outwardly. Crops grew, trade routes opened, borders held strong. Who would doubt kings under whom prosperity rolled like an unbroken tide? Yet power that is not rooted in the natural order always extracts its due. The nine began to feel its weight in their own bodies. They no longer marked the passage of years as others did. They looked upon sons who had grown to fathers, upon grandsons born while their own hair remained untouched by frost. What should have been joy turned unsettling, for the separation between themselves and their people widened until they were no longer of the same race, It was then that some among them began to sense unease in solitude. The rings, once warm upon the hand, felt colder, heavier. Dreams brought visions of towers in shadow, of fire, reflected in eyes not their own. Yet they were not dreams easily dismissed, for they bore the weight of commands, and when morning came, the kings often found themselves obeying impulses that seemed natural, though they could not say from where they arose. The distinction between choosing and being chosen eroded, until even their triumphs seemed less theirs than another's. To hold such a ring was not to hold a tool, but to be held by it. This was the deeper truth they had not grasped when first they slipped them upon their fingers. They had thought possession was mastery, that wearing meant owning. But ownership in such matters flows in the other direction. Slowly, subtly, inevitably, it was the rings that owned them. And so the question began to surface, faint and troubling. What does it mean to be seen forever? For the gaze of Sauron, through the One, fell upon them continually. Their victories, their triumphs, their desires, none unfolded beyond his perception. To be seen in such a way is not to be admired, but to be catalogued, weighed, and bound. The kings, though still proud upon their thrones, had already begun to live lives transparent to a will beyond their own. Thus, the invisible threads drew tighter. The Nine still walked in daylight, still bore names of kings and lords, yet within them the shift was already underway. To the world they seemed mighty, even invincible. To themselves, they still clung to the notion of sovereignty. But in truth, sovereignty was slipping away, replaced by a bond that none of them could sever. Before long, their very flesh would tell the cost, and the mirror would reveal what crowns could not conceal. Seasons passed, and the years no longer touched the Nine as they once had. Where other men bent beneath the slow weight of age, these kings remained upright, their hair unwhitened, their strength undimmed. To their subjects this seemed proof of blessing, though whispers stirred that such blessings were unnatural. A ruler who does not change while generations beneath him wither begins to feel less like a man and more like a monument, a figure carved of stone that endures while all else erodes. And monuments, however revered, are also feared, for they remind mortals of their own fragility. The first signs of change were delicate, almost imperceptible. A voice that once resonated warmly across a hall took on an edge of hollowness, as if two tones overlapped. Eyes that once looked with command now glimmered faintly, their depths carrying not only the king's thought but something watching from behind. Such subtleties unsettled those who noticed. A steward paused mid-sentence, unable to shake the sense that his lord's gaze had pierced not just his words but his unspoken fears. A soldier, proud to stand guard, shivered when the king passed by, though no hand had touched him. The kings themselves felt the change in subtler ways. Food lost some of its savor, as if the tongue could no longer wholly taste. The laughter of companions, once a balm, struck as distant, faint, like echoes heard through stone walls. At times they felt themselves fading, not in body, though that too would come, but in their relation to the world. They were present, yet not entirely, as if part of them were being drawn into a different current, a shadowed stream invisible to those around them. Their people sensed it. Rumors spread, as rumors always do, carried from marketplace to tavern, from hearth to caravan. Some whispered their kings were blessed by the Valar themselves, anointed to guide their realms into eternity. Others muttered darker suspicions, that bargains had been struck with powers best left unnamed, that their lords tarried too long in silence as though listening to voices no one else could hear. Faith and fear wrestled in the hearts of subjects, binding loyalty with unease, for in the presence of their rulers awe grew sharper, and awe's shadow is always dread. Yet outwardly, the kings gave no sign of alarm. Their victories continued, their borders held, their counsels obeyed. When challenged, they spoke with such force that even hardened adversary yielded. Their lands prospered, at least for a time, and prosperity silenced most doubts. Who dares question a monarch under whose reign abundance flourishes? And so the silence deepened, an unspoken pact between ruler and ruled. The people would not name their fears, and the kings would not reveal the changes they felt within. But silence, like shadow, has weight. In halls once filled with speech, words grew fewer. The Nine, each in his own court, began to speak less, as if language no longer fully belonged to them. When they did speak, their voices carried unnatural resonance, commanding yet cold. Advisors found themselves agreeing, even when their reason balked, compelled by a tone that left no room for dissent. To hear one's own assent slip unbidden from the lips is to realize that freedom itself is fraying. The kings may have believed they still chose their words, but already their voices carried the timber of another's will. Behind closed doors, the 9 wrestled with unease. Some stared long into mirrors, unsettled by what they saw. The reflection still bore their features, but thinly, faintly, as if a veil of mist hung between the flesh and the glass. A hand raised to touch the surface seemed insubstantial, its outline blurring at the edges. In such moments they trembled, though not outwardly. For what king could admit, even to himself, that his own body was beginning to slip away? Others found their dreams invaded. They wandered landscapes unfamiliar yet filled with dreadful recognition. Vast plains lit by red fire, towers piercing a black sky, gates opening into shadow, and always beyond sight yet near. A presence loomed, whispering in tones that were both command and caress. Upon waking, the kings dismissed such dreams as phantoms of rule, burdens of governance carried into sleep. Yet in their hearts a tremor remained, for the voice felt too real to be illusion, and its words too compelling to be forgotten. Still the rings gleamed upon their hands, and the allure of power continued. The allure of power continued. When their people bent before them, when armies faltered at their approach, when enemies trembled at the rumor of their names, they told themselves that such might justify the strangeness they endured. Power convinces by its fruits, even when the roots rot unseen. And so they pressed forward, holding their crowns firmly upon their brows, telling themselves they were kings yet untouched. But the world around them had already shifted. Where once courtiers laughed freely in their halls, now silence often reigned, as though the very air grew heavy. Where once their children had clung to their robes, now they kept a cautious distance, eyes filled with both reverence and unease. Love faltered into fear, and though the kings noticed, they buried the sting beneath pride. For to admit fear in the gaze of one's own kin is to admit one's throne is cracking. In time, the 9 ceased to ask questions aloud. Even among themselves, each bore his changes privately, wrapped in a dignity that forbade confession. They walked as sovereigns, but already the ground beneath their feet was shifting. Their kingdoms looked to them for guidance, yet the guidance they gave came less from their own hearts and more from impulses they could not wholly name. They still called it wisdom. They still called it foresight, but in quiet moments, when no one watched, they wondered if what moved through them was not foresight at all, but intrusion. The first signs of change, then, were not cataclysmic. They were subtle, lingering, woven into daily life until they seemed ordinary. Yet ordinary corruption is the most perilous, for it convinces the soul that nothing has altered, that one still stands as master of himself. By the time the 9 realized how deeply they had changed, it would be too late. For now the kingdoms endured, their banners high, their rulers proud. Yet a silence had entered their halls, a silence that deepened with every passing year. And in that silence, something else listened, patient and relentless, waiting for the moment when kingship itself would dissolve into shadow. What did the 9 tell themselves when the echoes of their own voices no longer sounded wholly their own, and how long could such silence hold before it broke? The gift of 9 rings was never meant to be free, and in truth it was no gift at all. From the moment the kings slipped them onto their fingers, their paths bent toward a design greater than their own. For in Middle-earth, power is not inert. It carries within it the memory of its maker, and these rings were not forged in innocence, nor in service of the bearers alone. They had been devised with precision, tuned to a single will, and that will belonged to Sauron. Though the kings saw only splendor, already the shadow had lengthened beneath their feet. The Dark Lord's influence was not a sudden storm, but a gradual tide. It pressed against their hearts invisibly, turning ambition into compulsion, turning vision into obsession. Each time a king called upon the ring, the connection deepened, as if the metal itself were a channel through which thought and desire flowed. They believed they were commanding, yet often what they commanded had already been whispered into them. It was domination not by shackles but by suggestion, a corrosion that wore down resistance until resistance itself seemed pointless. Distance did not matter. Whether the kings dwelt in northern strongholds or southern deserts, the net was woven equally about them. The one ring, hidden and supreme, pulsed at the center of that web, and through it Sauron's gaze fell unbroken upon all who bore its satellites. To be seen so constantly was not at first an agony. Many mistook it for inspiration, a sudden clarity of purpose, a vision sharper than they had ever known. But vision that does not originate in one's own mind is a hollow gift. Slowly the nine became vessels for thoughts not wholly their own, each believing still in sovereignty while unknowingly repeating another's intent. Their people began to feel it, though none could name it. The kings who once listened with patience now seemed distant, as if their ears had grown heavy. The rulers who once weighed counsel with care now often dismissed it swiftly, their decisions carrying an authority that felt absolute. There was no room left for dialogue, even when victories came, even when borders held firm. The triumph bore a strange emptiness. For dominion achieved by command alone without the heart of a leader becomes domination, and domination breeds silence. In secret moments, some of the nine wondered at the source of their impulses. They would find themselves giving orders that struck them as unusual, yet the words had left their mouths before they could reconsider. They would speak decrees that served no clear purpose for their kingdoms, yet carried with them a sense of inevitability, as though refusal was impossible. It was not compulsion felt as force, but persuasion felt as inevitability. And inevitability is the most potent chain, for it convinces the captive that he has chosen his own bonds. Sauron did not rush. His mastery was not only in the forging of weapons, but in the patience of corruption. He let the nine linger in their glory, allowed their pride to swell until the thought of surrendering their rings seemed absurd. They could not imagine reigning without them, for already they had become dependent. What was once an ornament had become a necessity, and what is necessity if not mastery disguised? Their lives were bound, their senses heightened and distorted, their desires sharpened into hungers that could never be satisfied. Even their victories carried Sauron's mark. When a rival kingdom fell, the triumph echoed not only in the halls of the conqueror, but in the shadows of Mordor. When a new citadel rose, its stones seemed to lean subtly toward the east, as though it too paid homage to the Dark Tower. The kings told themselves that these were coincidences, yet coincidences multiplied into patterns, and patterns revealed the truth. Nothing they did lay wholly outside Sauron's intent. The elves, wise in the nature of power, perceived this more clearly. They whispered warnings across forests and rivers, speaking of the slow corruption of men, of how the nine would in time be lost to themselves. But men seldom listen to elves, and kings least of all, for what ruler gladly admits that his crown is not his own? The nine turned their faces away from such counsel, preferring the comfort of their strength to the sting of truth. And so the shadow thickened. The kings still walked among their people, still rode at the head of armies, still wore their crowns in halls bright with torches. Yet something unseen accompanied them, a presence felt but not named. Courtiers grew pale in their company. Children withdrew, animals balked when they passed. It was not cruelty that caused it, nor any deliberate malice, but simply the fact that the kings were no longer holy men. They were becoming thresholds, doorways through which another will looked out. The corruption of the Nine illustrates the deepest danger of Middle-earth. Not that evil forces impose themselves openly, but that they infiltrate, blending so seamlessly with desire that resistance falters before it can even be raised. The Nine were not dragged into chains. They stepped willingly, even gratefully, into a covenant they mistook for blessing. What king, after all, would surrender a gift that made him greater than all rivals? What ruler would lay aside the very instrument that secured his throne? Pride is the strongest armor, yet it is also the thinnest when pierced by flattery. In time, the line between their own will and Sauron's will blurred entirely. They still believed they chose, but choice had become a word emptied of meaning. When Sauron's thought stirred, their thought stirred also. When Sauron desired, they desired. When Sauron willed, they obeyed, though they still cloaked obedience in the garments of sovereignty. To others they appeared as kings. To themselves they still whispered the illusion of mastery. But the truth was that mastery had shifted. The crowns they wore were already shadows, and the thrones beneath them no longer theirs. This is how domination functions in its most insidious form, not through force of arms alone, but through the quiet erosion of self, until the subject cannot distinguish where his own thought ends and another's begins. The Nine had entered that twilight. The world still hailed them as sovereigns, yet sovereignty was gone, drawn thread by thread into the unseen hand of the Dark Lord. And so the question deepens. When a king cannot tell the boundary between his own mind and the will of another, what remains of kingship at all? Time, once the measure of all mortal things, began to unravel for the Nine. Where once they had counted their reigns in years, in victories and in feasts, now the days blurred into one another, stretched thin like shadows drawn at dusk. At first it seemed a blessing. Their limbs did not tire, their skin did not wrinkle, their crowns did not slip from brows weathered by age. Yet slowly the blessing soured, for to endure unchanged is to fall out of rhythm with the world. Seasons turned, generations rose and fell, yet the Nine remained as statues in their halls, and statues are not companions to the living. The first evidence of the curse was felt in the body. What had been solid grew light, as though the substance of flesh were being thinned. Hands that once bore the warmth of blood now felt cool to the touch, their strength intact, but their weight diminished. Some noticed in mirrors that their reflections had paled, their outlines less certain. At feasts, goblets lifted in ritual, they found that wine dulled on their tongues, leaving no true taste. Meat and bread filled their bellies, yet hunger lingered as if unsatisfied. To eat without savor, to drink without warmth, these were not the joys of men, but the hollow motions of something enduring against its nature. Their people saw it too. A father would look upon his king and whisper that he had seen that same face in his own childhood, and his child would echo the same words in turn. Subjects began to lower their eyes when their lords passed, not only in respect but in quiet dread, for what kind of man remains unchanged while the world withers around him? To them, their rulers seemed both eternal and absent, as though the essence of humanity had already withdrawn, leaving behind an image that moved and spoke but no longer belonged fully to the realm of the living. For the kings themselves, the most chilling discovery came in solitude, when dawn spilled across stone chambers, and light should have struck familiar forms. Some saw no figure reflected back from polished bronze or silver. At first they thought it trickery, a flaw in the surface. But the more they looked, the clearer the truth became. The mirror no longer obeyed. The body that stood before it was not wholly there, not fully visible to light. What does it mean when the world of substance begins to lose sight of you, even as you still walk its roads? The fading did not come swiftly, but with cruel patience. It was not the sudden tearing of flesh from spirit, but the slow erosion of presence. They remained tangible, yet less so. Their footsteps grew softer, their shadows less distinct. Even their voices, once ringing with command, sometimes sounded muted to mortal ears, as though muffled by a veil. They still ruled, still spoke, still touched, but the world responded with hesitation. Servants startled when addressed, courtiers blinked as though unsure from where the sound had come. To be half heard is to be half real, and the Nine were learning what it meant to exist between realms. Sauron had planned it so, for in fading the kings drew closer to his design. Their flesh weakened, but their senses of the unseen sharpened. Where once they saw the world of stone and soil, now other visions pierced their gaze, outlines of presences not bound to matter, whispers of voices long departed, currents of power flowing like unseen rivers through the air. It was revelation, but it was also torment, for to see such things is to be drawn away from the simple ground beneath one's feet. They dwelled increasingly in two worlds, neither fully in one nor wholly in the other. At night, dreams deepened into voyages. They wandered landscapes of shadow, saw figures cloaked in flame, and heard commands spoken not in words, but in iron certainty. The one ring, far distant, pulsed at the heart of their being, and through it Sauron's hand closed ever tighter. What they perceived as new strength was in truth the stripping away of what remained of their mortality. And mortality, though fragile, is also the anchor of meaning. Without it, their triumphs became hollow, their joys ash, their crowns cold metal that mocked them with weight, but offered no comfort. Some among them resisted in thought, clinging to fragments of who they had once been. They remembered wives long buried, children whose names now faded, cities built by hands they could no longer feel as kin. Yet memory brought no deliverance. It sharpened the pain of their estrangement, reminding them of the distance between who they were and what they were becoming. Others abandoned even this, embracing the fading as destiny, telling themselves they had transcended the weakness of flesh. But transcendence without choice is no glory. It is only exile from the natural order. The world outside responded to their transformation with increasing unease. Horses reared when they drew near, dogs howled, birds fell silent. It was not cruelty that silenced the creatures, but recognition, for beasts sense what men refuse to name. And so the courts grew colder, emptier of laughter, until the kings walked through their halls like shades in their own lifetimes. The loyalty of their subjects persisted, for fear sustains allegiance when love fails. But loyalty born of fear is brittle, and beneath its surface lies despair. As the fading advanced, the Nine no longer belonged to their crowns. Thrones once carved for their majesty now seemed vast and hollow, as if mocking the fragile forms that sat upon them. The people no longer whispered of blessings, but of curses, though such whispers were spoken only in secret, behind closed shutters, with eyes glancing to doorways, lest the king's shadow overhear. Fear had replaced devotion, and with fear came isolation, for no man can be companion to a phantom, and no lord can share his heart, when his heart no longer beats in mortal measure. And so the curse unfolded, longevity without life, presence without weight, power without joy. To fade was not merely to weaken, it was to be unmoored from the world, to lose the very reflection that proves existence. The Nine had sought to outlast time, and in a manner they had succeeded, yet what endures without substance is not immortality, but vacancy. They were becoming less and less themselves, their bodies still clad in robes, their crowns still gleaming, but their essence slipping into shadow. One king, standing before a mirror that showed him nothing, touched his own cheek with trembling fingers, desperate to feel substance where none appeared. In that moment he understood the truth, that the price of power was not only servitude, but dissolution. What remained to him if even his image could no longer be trusted? What was a king without a face? Thus the slow erasure advanced, relentless as the tide. Flesh still clung to bone, but its days were numbered, and in the silence between heartbeats the shadow whispered its claim. Soon they would be kings no longer, but wraiths in service of another throne. What then would rise in the void where identity had once stood? The fading, once subtle, could no longer be hidden. In their halls, in their strongholds, upon their thrones, the nine no longer appeared as kings of flesh, but as shadows draped in robes, their crowns gleaming faintly above forms that were neither fully seen nor wholly absent. What began as whispers in glass and dreams had become the permanent state of their being. They had crossed the threshold, and in crossing they lost the last remnants of ordinary life. They were Nazgûl now, Ringwraiths bound beyond redemption. To step into this condition was to enter a twilight existence. They walked in daylight, but the light did not touch them. They could stand in open sun, yet it seemed to pass through them, casting no warmth. Mortals who met their gaze shrank back, for though their forms were obscured, their presence was unbearable, as though each man stood before a truth too vast and merciless for human eyes. They had become beings of dread, and dread itself was their language. Yet with the loss of flesh came the gaining of a new sight. Where once they had known the solidity of walls, the fragrance of earth, the warmth of fire, now they perceived what lay beyond those things. They saw the unseen realm, the shadow world, where shapes lingered that the living could not perceive. Spirits, echoes of deeds long past, currents of power that bent the air. They all stood unveiled before the Nazgûl. It was not gift but chain. For such sight forever estranges one from the simple rhythm of mortal life. To see what others cannot is to stand apart, and the nine stood apart utterly. Their voices too had changed. Where once they had spoken as men, now their cries pierced the hearts of armies, turning courage into despair. Soldiers who would face steel and fire without faltering, broke and fled at the sound of that wailing, for it carried with it the terror of emptiness, the echo of beings who had stepped beyond life yet had not died. It was not mere fear of death, but the horror of unbeing, the recognition that the one who cried out had surrendered humanity and become something hollow. Even the bravest faltered, for courage depends upon meaning, and the sound of the Nazgûl was the sound of meaning dissolving. They did not eat as men eat, nor sleep as men sleep. Sustenance came not from bread or water, but from the will of the One Ring, whose pulse bound them in permanence. Rest was denied, for shadows do not tire, but neither do they dream in comfort. When the Nazgûl lay still, their thoughts were pulled into the same vast presence that ruled them, receiving commands that arrived not as words but as inevitabilities. What once had been a private mind was now an open chamber through which the Dark Lord's will flowed ceaseless. And yet, within them, remnants remained, fragments of who they had been. In the depths of silence, some still remembered crowns of gold, sons and daughters, the laughter of courts, the smell of rain on their own soil. But memory had become torment, for it was powerless. To recall humanity without the ability to live it is to suffer doubly, once for the loss and again for the knowledge that it will never return. Others pushed memory away, burying it under the mantle of their new form, preferring emptiness to sorrow. But even emptiness cannot erase what once was loved, and so fragments clung like embers, dim yet refusing to vanish. Their presence became a weapon. Entire regions whispered of them. Entire peoples lived in fear. Tales spread of riders who came by night, cloaked in darkness, their faces unseen, their voices unbearable. Fields were abandoned at rumor of their approach. Fortresses surrendered before battle. They were no longer kings of land, but kings of dread. Their dominion carved not by stone or steel, but by terror that spread like a mist into every heart. And yet this was no true dominion, for dread rules only until it collapses under its own emptiness. The Nine were feared, but they were never loved, and rule without love is ruin. The irony of their fate lay bare. In seeking to be more than men, they had become less. They had desired to endure, yet they had endured only as echoes. They had sought to expand their vision, yet they had lost the beauty of the world before their eyes. They had sought crowns eternal, and now they bore only hoods that hid their vanished faces. To their enemies, they were nightmares. To themselves, they were prisons, and in this prison, the chains were invisible, but no less absolute. Still, they served, for their being was bound not to their own desires, but to the One Ring, and through it, to Sauron. When he willed, they moved. When he commanded, they pursued. They had no will but his, though each still carried the faint illusion of choice, like a shadow mimicking a body it no longer touches. They rode forth as his messengers, his hunters, his heralds of fear, and each step carried them further from what they had once been, for the path of service to shadow has no turning. Among themselves they were silent. No laughter, no debate, no counsel passed between them. Communication was no longer needed, for their thoughts already converged in the same source. To see them together was to see not 9 men, but 9 extensions of a single will. They did not argue, for argument requires independence. They did not plot, for plotting requires privacy. They were united perfectly, and perfect unity is indistinguishable from perfect loss. Thus the transformation was complete. They were no longer lords who wore rings. They were the rings themselves given form, hollow vessels animated by the will that had bound them. To encounter them was to meet not the king of Khand, nor the monarch of Harad, nor the warlord of the northern wastes, but simply a Nazgûl, a wraith, a void where a man had once stood. And yet, in the quiet corners of their fading minds, one question lingered, unanswered and unanswerable. Was there still something of the king within? Or had the last ember already been smothered beneath the cloak of shadow? Their cries had become the very language of terror. Armies broke at their approach, not because swords were drawn, but because the sound of their voices cleaved the courage from men's hearts. The Nazgûl no longer needed to brandish steel to command obedience. Their presence alone, sharpened by the shrill wailing that poured from mouths unseen, sent seasoned captains trembling and drove horses mad with fear. Yet the more their voices gained power in the world of others, the less they belonged to themselves. Once, each of the 9 had spoken with the tones of kings, steady, commanding, grounded in the gravity of rule. But that era was buried beneath the tide of shadow. The voices that now left their lips were no longer voices in the truest sense. They were echoes of the One, fragments of Sauron's command, refracted through hollow throats. What they uttered was not always what they intended, for intent itself had become blurred. To speak was to yield, and to yield was to reinforce the will that had unmade them. Those who heard the Nazgûl remembered not words but impressions, dread like a suffocating cloak, despair so sudden it felt as though the ground itself betrayed them. Even when they issued commands in plain speech, the syllables seemed heavy, as though the air itself recoiled. Such was the paradox of their existence. The more terrible their voices became, the less they had any voice at all. In gaining power to command others, they had surrendered the ability to command themselves. Among mortals, stories multiplied. It was said their cries carried death, that no warrior could meet their sound and live. Some claimed to have heard them in sleep, distant yet near, haunting the edges of dream. Others whispered that the mere memory of their wail was enough to unman a soldier who had once endured it. The Nazgûl became less individuals and more myth, less kings and more archetypes of dread. And myth itself is a kind of silence, for no human soul lies clearly within it, only shadow and symbol. Yet within the hollowness, a question lingered. Did the Nine still think themselves speaking? Did fragments of their original selves believe they uttered words of reason and authority, unaware that what passed their lips had been transformed into terror? If so, then their tragedy was deeper still. For what worse fate than to believe one is heard, when in truth one has been replaced by an echo of another? The silence of their own minds grew heavier as the years advanced. They no longer debated, no longer counseled, no longer shared thought as sovereigns once did. Each was a hollow chamber, filled with the reverberation of Sauron's will, and chambers filled only with echoes know no dialogue. When they assembled, they did not converse. They aligned. Their speech was not exchange, but resonance, each repeating the vibration of the one, until no distinction remained. Still, they acted, and in acting the world trembled. Fortresses yielded not to sword but to dread. Gates fell open not to fire but to silence, as defenders abandoned their posts before the cry of the Ringwraiths. Armies fled, cities despaired, kingdoms withered beneath fear, and fear is a weapon more efficient than blade or flame. It was the paradox of their ruin. In surrendering themselves, they became unmatched in unmaking others. But power without self is not power. It is only the extension of another's hand. The Nazgûl had become instruments, not agents. And here lies the core of their tragedy. They had not been destroyed by the rings, but hollowed into vessels, their own wills poured out and replaced with another's. A voice that no longer belongs to its speaker is no voice at all. There were moments, perhaps, in the long silence of their wandering, when faint remnants stirred. A wraith, standing upon a ruined battlement, might hear in the far distance the cry of a child, and remember dimly the laughter of his own, long buried. In such fleeting instants his silence deepened, as though shame lingered where humanity had once lived. But memory offered no redemption. It was powerless, and powerlessness only bound them more tightly to the will that held them. To mortals their cries were unbearable. To themselves their silence was worse. For silence within is the measure of enslavement, and the Nine had become perfectly silent, their voices mere channels for another's design. They had thought that immortality meant permanence, that to endure was to prevail. Yet endurance without self is only unending vacancy, and their voices proved it. So it was that terror became their weapon, and silence their prison. They walked across the lands as heralds of dread, scattering armies with cries that were not their own. Yet behind those cries lay the unspoken question that no one could answer. If the voice itself is stolen, what remains of choice, and what remains of the man who once spoke freely? They were no longer kings of men, no longer fathers, husbands, or sovereigns, seated upon gilded thrones. They were servants, and the master they served dwelled in the dark tower. To the world they appeared as shadows, wrapped in cloaks, horsemen whose approach was heralded by dread, but within themselves they were bound as tightly as iron to an anvil. Their wills had been dissolved, their purposes redirected, until only one thread remained: obedience to Sauron. From Mordor, his summons reached them, not as words but as inevitabilities pressed into their being. To resist was unthinkable, not because resistance was punished, but because resistance had long since been stripped away. When he willed, they moved. When he turned his gaze, they followed. They were his sight beyond the walls of Barad-dûr, his dread carried upon the wind, his agents sent into lands where his armies had not yet marched. The Nazgûl were extensions of his shadow, walking emissaries of his dominion. Their service was not confined to a single place. They rode across Middle-earth as hunters and forcers and heralds, leaving behind the memory of fear wherever their horses' hooves struck the earth. Villagers abandoned their homes at rumor of their passing. Fortresses surrendered before their swords were drawn. Theirs was a presence that reigned resistance, a living sign that the Dark Lord's reach was never far. Yet for all their vast power, it was not their own. They carried no purpose except the one that pulsed from the ring. Their dwelling place in those years was Minas Morgul, once fair Minas Ithil, captured and corrupted into a fortress of dread. Its walls gleamed with a sickly light, pale as rot, casting shadows that chilled all who looked upon it. Within those walls the Nazgûl gathered, cloaked in silence, waiting until Sauron's will stirred them to action. No feast echoed there, no song, no council of free lords. Only silence broken by whispers of commands that descended from afar. It was a place not of life but of waiting, as though the fortress itself held its breath for the wars to come. In their service, they became symbols as much as soldiers. To the peoples of Gondor, Rohan, and the northern realms, the Nazgûl represented the certainty of despair. They were proof that resistance against Mordor was futile, for who could stand against kings who had already surrendered their humanity and become shadows? Armies knew that if the wraiths marched, terror itself would walk before Sauron's hosts. Entire campaigns collapsed without battle, for men who dread their enemy before he arrives are already defeated. Yet within their own being, the Nine bore the emptiness of service. They no longer desired victory, no longer measured glory, no longer sought crowns or cities for themselves. All desire had been refined into a single point to carry out what was demanded of them. If once they had dreamt of empires eternal, those dreams had withered into ash, for empire presumes independence, and they had none. Service was no choice, but it was all that remained. Still, faint remnants stirred from time to time. Some among them perhaps looked upon Minas Morgul's twisted towers, and dimly remembered the citadels they once ruled, now gone to ruin. Others, in the silence between commands, may have recalled the faces of those who once called them lord or father. But such memories brought no rebellion. They had been hollowed too thoroughly for revolt. Instead, the memories only deepened their silence, shadows reflecting upon what they had lost and could never regain. And so they endured, servants who could not cease to serve. When Sauron directed their gaze toward the borders of Gondor, they moved. When he sent them to hunt whispers of defiance in the wilds, they obeyed. When he required fear to be sown in distant lands, their cries carried it. Their service was relentless, yet joyless, their victories as empty as their hearts. For to achieve on behalf of another is not true triumph, but the prolonging of enslavement. Their role in the great wars was not to build, but to unmake. They broke alliances before they could form, shattered courage before swords were drawn, and drained hope before banners were raised. They were the prelude to destruction, the shadow that precedes the storm. And in this their servitude bore fruit, though it was fruit of ruin. For every fortress abandoned, every village emptied, every army scattered, the Dark Lord's dominion grew, and with it the chains that bound the Nazgûl drew tighter. There were those who asked if any fragment of the men they once were survived beneath the cloaks. Could a king still dwell within the wraith, waiting, silent, hoping for deliverance? But deliverance requires freedom, and freedom had been extinguished. If fragments remained, they were powerless ghosts, embers without flame. What stood upon the black horses were not men, but vessels, animated shadows answering to a single will. Thus their service became their identity, and their identity was service. The nine were no longer remembered by name, nor by the lands they once ruled, nor by the crowns they once wore. They were remembered only as the Nazgûl, the Ringwraiths, the nine servants of the Dark Lord. Their individuality had dissolved, and only the collective remained, bound together in silence and dread. And yet in the quiet of their existence, a question lingered like a wound that would not close. If all that remains is service, is there anything left of the self at all? Or had the last fragments of the men they once were been extinguished entirely, leaving behind only shadows moving at the command of another? The world called them wraiths, yet within the cloaked shadows that served Sauron there lingered fragments too stubborn to fade. Memory is not so easily extinguished, even when the body is dissolved and the voice no longer its own. Beneath the black hoods, in the silence between commands, the nine sometimes felt the faint stirrings of lives they once had lived. A crown heavy on a mortal brow, a wife's hand placed gently upon a shoulder, the cries of a child chasing sunlight across a courtyard now long gone to ruin. These recollections rose like smoke, insubstantial yet persistent, reminding them of thrones and kin that no longer existed. It was not mercy that preserved these fragments, but torment. For to remember is to feel the weight of loss, and the nine had lost everything but their chains. They could not act upon memory, nor speak it aloud, nor find solace in it. Instead, memory became a kind of haunting, not imposed by others, but by themselves. When they stood upon a battlefield, their unseen eyes might flicker with the image of another war, one fought centuries before in the name of a kingdom whose walls had long since crumbled. When they crossed ruined lands, they might recall fields once green beneath their reign, now ashes beneath their presence. Memory followed them like a shadow that no cloak could conceal. To mortals, the Nazgûl were beings of terror, faceless and merciless, yet the truth was more tragic. They were hollowed men who still carried within them the ghost of what they had been. The tragedy of memory lay in its impotence. They remembered humanity but could not inhabit it. They recalled love but could not feel it. They preserved names, but those names no longer belonged to them, for the world knew them only as wraiths. To be remembered as something one no longer is, and yet still to feel it echo within, is a sorrow deeper than erasure. Some among the nine may have clung more fiercely to memory, unwilling to let it slip entirely. Such kings might have stood in silence within Minas Morgul's pale-lit halls, recalling with painful clarity the architecture of their vanished citadels, the banners of colors never again to be seen. Others, weary of torment, may have sought to bury memory beneath obedience, silencing even the whispers of the past. Yet memory has a way of returning, especially when bound in loss, and so, whether embraced or denied, it remained, a wound that could not close. It is said that a man's memory shapes his being. But what becomes of being when memory is divorced from action? For the Nazgûl, memory was not life but mockery. They could recall what it meant to speak as kings, but their voices were now echoes of Sauron's command. They could recall what it meant to walk among their people, yet now the mere sight of them scattered villages in terror. They could recall what it meant to protect, yet their presence brought only despair. In every memory was contradiction, and in every contradiction grief. The servants of the Dark Tower did not confess such things, for confession requires fellowship, and fellowship had long been extinguished among them. They did not share memory with one another, nor speak of the lives they had lost. Each bore his fragments in silence, locked in an inner prison that no word could open. If there was kinship among the nine, it was only in the shared knowledge of absence, the unspoken awareness that all had once been more, and none could ever be again. To the world beyond, such sorrow was invisible. Mortals saw only the consequence, not the cause. Cloaked riders spreading dread, unseen eyes that pierced courage, voices that carried despair. Few would have believed that behind the veil of shadow might linger even the faintest memory of a human heart. Yet perhaps it was precisely this memory that made them so dreadful, for in their presence men felt not only the threat of death, but the weight of unbeing, the recognition that humanity can be hollowed while the shell remains. If any mercy lay within these fragments, it was faint and twisted. Sometimes, perhaps, the Nazgûl's hesitation upon a battlefield was not weakness, but the flicker of remembrance, a shadow of the man who once swore to protect rather than destroy. But such mercy never lasted. The will of the ring overrode all hesitation, pulling them back into the certainty of obedience. In the end, memory offered no escape, only delay, and even delay could not alter the inevitability of their service. Legends grew around the Nine, each tale shaping them into symbols. To some they were demons from beyond the world. To others they were cursed kings, men who had reached too high and paid the price. In truth, both were correct, for they were kings who had become shadows, and their very existence was a testament to the peril of desire. But within the cloaks, within the silence, they remained aware, dimly, tragically, that once they had been more than this. Thus their burden was doubled. They were enslaved to another's will, yet still haunted by the remembrance of their own. They were hollow, yet not empty, for emptiness is clean, but hollowness carries the echo of what has been removed, and echoes have a way of persisting long after the voice is gone. And so the Nazgûl endured, moving through the world as wraiths, feared by all, loved by none, remembered only for terror. Yet within them memory lingered, faint as dying embers, tormenting them with glimpses of crowns they no longer wore, and voices they no longer commanded. The world saw shadows, but the shadows themselves knew what they had lost. What then does it mean when memory itself becomes a weapon? For the fragments they carried could not be erased, and those fragments would in time be turned not only into torment for themselves, but into dread for others, wielded by the very hand that had bound them. Among the Nine, one rose above the others, not by chance, nor by contest, but because Sauron willed it so. He became their captain, their chief, the vessel through which the Dark Lord's authority was most sharply expressed. In time, the world would know him as the Witch King of Angmar, a title forged in dread and conquest, though his mortal name was lost, erased as thoroughly as the man who once bore it. To the free peoples he was the greatest of the Nine, the embodiment of their terror, the figure whose shadow lengthened over entire kingdoms until ruin followed. Yet to himself, if anything of himself remained, he was simply the first to have yielded most completely, the one in whom Sauron's will found the least resistance. His dominion began in the north, in the realm of Angmar, where the icy mountains and barren wastes provided him both refuge and vantage. There he established a seat of power, a kingdom that bore his mark, though it was no true kingdom in the mortal sense. It was a citadel of dread, a gathering of fell armies, a throne raised not to endure, but to unmake. The Witch King's rule was not the building of cities, nor the nurturing of lands, but the spreading of corruption, the weakening of neighbors, the sowing of division among the realms of men. Where once the northern kingdoms of Arnor stood proud, united in heritage, they fell one by one beneath his patient campaign, fractured and consumed until little remained but ruin. This conquest was not sudden. It stretched across centuries, a long war of attrition waged, as only a being unbound by time could wage. The Witch King understood what mortal rulers did not, that decay is a slower, surer weapon than fire. He did not need to crush with overwhelming force. He needed only to erode. He planted seeds of distrust among brothers, encouraged rivalries between cities, and turned kinship into suspicion. When the moment was right, he struck with armies of orcs and men who had bent beneath his shadow, and each time the northern realm of Arnor diminished further, until the proud line of kings who had once traced their blood to Númenor dwindled into scattered remnants. Yet the Witch King's victories were hollow, as all the victories of the Nine were. He reigned, but reigned not for himself. His armies marched, but marched not for his own glory. His conquests brought him no crown, no lineage, no true dominion. All he gained was more ruin to place at Sauron's feet, more devastation to extend the reach of another's will. He was feared, and fear itself became his title. But fear is not sovereignty. Fear is only a tool, and he was its wielder, not its master. Still, the lands trembled at his name. To ride against the Witch King was to invite despair, for he carried with him not only sword and command, but the aura of dread that no mortal could withstand for long. Generals who marshaled armies with pride found themselves faltering before his unseen gaze. Soldiers who had fought bravely against countless foes found their courage dissolving into ash. His very presence broke the will to fight, and in this way he conquered more thoroughly than any warlord. Victory that arises before a blade is drawn is the most complete of all, for it is written in the heart, not upon the battlefield. The downfall of Arnor bore the clearest mark of his work. The realm fractured into smaller kingdoms, each too weak to stand against him. Arthedain, Cardolan, and Rudor, all once brothers, turned inward or against each other, leaving them vulnerable to the relentless pressure of Angmar. One by one he extinguished their lights, until only ragged survivors clung to scraps of their heritage. The Witch King had undone not just a realm, but a legacy, severing threads that had bound men to their noble past. It was a victory of despair, and despair is the deepest conquest. Yet, as with all victories of the Nine, it was temporary. The Witch King's power, though vast, was tethered to Sauron, and when the Dark Lord's presence waned, so too did his servant's strength. Armies rose against him, led by the last remnants of the northern Dúnedain, aided by the elves of Lindon and Rivendell. In battle they drove him back, not by courage alone, but by the strength of hope unquenched. For hope is the one weapon shadow cannot wholly erode. When at last he was defeated in the north, his fortress fell into ruin, and Angmar's reign ended. But the Witch King himself did not perish, for he was beyond the reach of ordinary death. He fled, returning to the shadows, bound still to the ring, his service unbroken. What then was the meaning of such triumphs and defeats? To the free peoples, the Witch King's campaigns were disasters, scars etched into their histories. To himself, they were mere chapters in an endless service, victories without joy, defeats without shame. For when a being is enslaved utterly, even defeat carries no sting. For there is no pride to wound. He endured not as a king, nor even as a conqueror, but as a shadow fulfilling its design. Still, in the silence between campaigns, perhaps fragments of memory stirred even in him. Perhaps upon the battlements of Angmar, gazing out across snowbound lands, he dimly recalled the warmth of a throne room long vanished. Perhaps, hearing the cry of his armies, he remembered the laughter of his people before they too were lost to time. But such recollections, if they came, were no longer his to cherish. They were only torment for a servant who serves without choice, cannot find solace in remembering what choice once meant. Thus the Witch King of Angmar became more than a wraith. He became a symbol of inevitability, the embodiment of what happens when surrender is complete, when memory is drowned beneath obedience. His reign in the north was not the rise of a kingdom, but the spreading of a shadow, a warning written in ruin. And though he was cast down, He endured, for his existence was tied not to his throne, but to the ring that bound him. He had seemed victorious, but in truth his triumphs were as hollow as his form. For what is an empire worth if it exists only to collapse? And what is conquest if it serves only another's will? The Witch King's rise in Angmar had proven the dreadful power of the Nine. Yet his reign revealed more than military conquest. It revealed the weapon that defined them above all others, a weapon sharper than steel and more enduring than stone. Terror. The Nazgûl did not rule with armies alone, nor with the simple strength of arms. They ruled by unraveling the will to resist. Terror preceded them like a herald, entering into hearts long before their cloaked forms were seen upon the horizon. Villages abandoned fields at rumor of their approach, citadels faltered at the whisper of their cries, and soldiers found themselves defeated before battle began. Fear was their true dominion, and fear conquered more swiftly than any blade. But terror is a double-edged weapon. To wield it is to poison not only one's enemies but also the ground one walks upon. The Nazgûl were masters of despair, yet despair cannot nurture loyalty, nor can it sustain a kingdom. The Witch King's empire in Angmar crumbled not because his armies were weaker, but because empires built on dread are doomed to collapse. No subject ever loved him, no ally trusted him, no neighbor bent willingly to his cause. His dominion was hollow, and hollow dominion erodes itself. Thus, when strength arrayed against him was great enough, his foundation collapsed, and Angmar fell into ruin. Still, the terror of the Nazgûl remained. They did not need thrones to wield it, nor citadels to anchor it. Wherever they walked, fear was their fortress, and in fear they found their strongest advantage. Tales spread across generations, tales of riders unseen yet felt, of voices that pierced courage like knives. Mothers warned children never to wander at dusk, lest a shadowed rider appear. Warriors invoked charms against the wail of the wraiths, knowing charms were useless but desperate for comfort. Their legend grew larger than their presence, and in legend their power multiplied. The paradox of their existence deepened here. The Nazgûl themselves no longer desired fear. They no longer sought to inspire dread for its own sake. Desire itself had been stripped from them, hollowed until only obedience remained. Yet their very being had become inseparable from terror, as if shadow clung to them like a garment that could not be shed. To walk among men was to carry despair like a contagion. They did not choose to wield it. They were, and therein lay their curse. Their identity was no longer their own, but the reflection of what others saw and fled from. Among the free peoples, their dread was unmatched, but dread does not translate into true victory. For fear can scatter an army, but it cannot hold a land. Fear can silence a city, but it cannot plant seed in the soil, nor draw laughter back into its streets. Fear devours itself, leaving only emptiness behind. The Witch King of Angmar learned this, and though he endured beyond the fall of his kingdom, the lesson was written across the ruin he left. He had wielded terror more perfectly than any warlord before him, yet the cost was the collapse of all he sought to claim. In time, the Nine were summoned again to serve, not as rulers of kingdoms, but as hunters of the Dark Lord's enemies. They became less like monarchs and more like storm winds, unleashed where resistance threatened to kindle. They were sent to enforce Sauron's will, to strike down defiance before it could rise into open rebellion. And each time, it was terror that achieved what steel alone could not. Men who might resist armies surrendered at the approach of wraiths. Cities that might endure siege collapsed at the sound of their cries. The Nine were less soldiers than symbols, embodiments of inevitability, proof that no courage could last against the shadow forever. Yet this weapon they wielded so flawlessly was also their prison. for in becoming terror, they lost all else. They could no longer inspire trust, nor command loyalty, nor dwell among others as companions. Their solitude was profound, deeper than exile, for even among themselves they were only reflections of the same echo, bound together not by fellowship, but by enslavement. Fear ruled their presence outwardly, and silence ruled their hearts inwardly. What remained of their humanity had no soil in which to grow. Mortals who faced them often believed they encountered pure evil, willful malice embodied, but the truth was subtler, and therefore more tragic. The Nazgûl did not act from hatred, nor from ambition. They acted because they had no choice. Their deeds were dreadful, but their dread was not born of passion. It was the shadow of absence, the hollow sound of voices long erased. To be feared without will, to inspire terror without desire, is to become the very definition of enslavement. Their weapon was also their wound, and the more dread they spread, the deeper their silence grew. Still, the Dark Lord's purpose was served. He had not forged the Nine to be kings of nations, nor to be loved or remembered as sovereigns. He had forged them to be fear-given form, shadows that moved ahead of his armies, heralds that broke resolve before swords clashed. And in this they succeeded perfectly. Their presence on the battlefield shifted wars before they began. They were more than lieutenants. They were symbols of futility, the embodiment of despair. And yet, what is more futile than to embody futility itself? Thus their existence traced the cruel irony of their fate. They had sought power, yet their power had become emptiness. They had sought glory, yet their glory was only the reflection of dread in the eyes of their enemies. They had sought permanence, yet permanence delivered only isolation, for what endures without change is not life, but stagnation. Their triumphs revealed not their mastery, but their loss, and each time they unmade the courage of others, they were reminded of their own unmaking. In their cries, men heard despair. In their silence, the Nazgûl themselves endured it. And though they shattered armies and scattered kings, they could not restore what they had lost: the ability to stand as men among men, to be rulers in truth rather than vessels of fear. Their weapon was their cage, and their cage was unbreakable, for it was forged not of iron but of absence. And so, when the time came for them to be sent forth again, not as conquerors but as hunters, the world would feel the sharpest edge of that weapon. For terror, though hollow, spreads faster than flame, and the Nine would be loosed upon the earth, not to hold thrones, but to pursue a single object, whose loss would unravel all shadow. They would become hunters of the ring itself, carrying with them not only the strength of Sauron, but the emptiness that made them what they were. For what does it mean when beings defined by inevitability encounter resistance they cannot overcome? When the One Ring resurfaced, the Nazgûl were stirred from silence as never before. Their service had always bound them to Sauron's will, but now their very essence quivered with urgency, for the ring was not only their master's instrument, it was the core of their own being. The Nine were not merely hunters sent upon a mission. They were fragments of the ring itself, shards of Sauron's power given form, and in its absence they had lived as half-shadows. To recover it was not duty alone, it was compulsion, a need deeper than hunger or breath. They rode forth, clad in cloaks that hid the void beneath, their black steeds carrying them across leagues with unrelenting pace. Word of their passage spread swiftly, for terror travels faster than hoofbeats. In villages of the south, people barred their doors at sunset. In the north, farmers abandoned fields as whispers spoke of riders cloaked in shadow. They sought the ring-bearer, though they did not yet know his name, and their hunt carried them into the quiet land of the Shire, a place that had known little of dread until their arrival. To the hobbits who glimpsed them, the Nazgûl were nightmares made flesh. They moved with purpose yet without haste, their unseen eyes piercing hedgerows and lanes, sniffing the air for scent of the ring. Their voices, when heard, were scarcely voices at all but dry whispers, chilling to the marrow. Though the Shire had no armies, no fortresses, no citadels to withstand, the very presence of the Ringwraiths sufficed to drain courage from even the stoutest hearts. The hobbits hid, fled, or froze in silence as the riders passed, for no simple folk could withstand such dread. Yet here, for the first time, the inevitability of the Nazgûl faltered, for though terror was their greatest weapon, it was not invincible. Frodo, bearing the ring, felt the pull of their presence, the terrible desire to slip the ring upon his finger and yield himself to their gaze. Yet though the temptation nearly overcame him, resistance stirred in ways the Nazgûl had not foreseen. Friends stood beside him, simple hobbits without armies or crowns, but bound by loyalty and courage not easily broken. Where dread should have scattered them, fellowship held them. It was a force alien to the Nazgûl, for fellowship is born of choice freely given, and choice was the very thing they no longer possessed. Their pursuit drove Frodo from his home and into the wide world, each step hunted by the Nine. They followed across rivers and fields, their cries echoing in the night, filling dreams with despair. On the road to Bree they drew close enough to strike, and Frodo felt the cold of their blades, yet even then resistance rose against them. Aragorn, a man bound not by fear but by purpose, stood in their path. With firebrand and sword he defied them, and the Ringwraiths recoiled, not in defeat but in momentary withdrawal. For though their terror was vast, there remained weapons in the world that could withstand it: fire, light, and the courage born of hope. Their hunt reached its most dreadful pitch upon Weathertop, where 5 of the 9 encircled Frodo and his companions. In the shadow of the hill they advanced, blades gleaming with malice, their forms towering as more than mere shadows. Frodo, in despair, placed the ring upon his finger, and in that instant their unseen faces were revealed to him, pale, cruel, crowned, yet hollow, their humanity twisted into mockery. To his sight they were terrible kings, their eyes alight with hunger for the ring. They struck, and Frodo was pierced by the Morgul blade, a wound meant not to kill but to draw him into their realm, to make him as they were. But again resistance arose. Aragorn drove them back with fire, and though their power was not ended, their certainty was shaken. The ring was within their grasp, yet it eluded them, carried onward by forces they had not reckoned with. The hobbits' stubborn resilience, the rangers' leadership, the unseen hand of a higher providence, all these conspired against inevitability. For the first time in long centuries, the Nazgûl encountered the truth that their terror was not absolute. The world could still resist. Their pursuit did not end. They tracked Frodo to the ford of Brunnen, where all 9 rode together, black steeds thundering, their cries shattering the air. There, on the river's edge, they closed upon the ring-bearer at last. Yet the waters rose in sudden wrath, summoned by Elrond's power, and the flood swept down upon them like living horses of foam and fury. The Ringwraiths, for all their dread, could not withstand the river's force. They were swept away, their steeds drowned, their forms scattered. They were not destroyed, for their existence was bound to the ring itself. But their defeat was undeniable. The ring had slipped once more beyond their grasp. This failure revealed the deepest truth of their being. The Nazgûl were terrifying, but terror alone is not victory. They embodied inevitability, yet inevitability had been thwarted by courage, by chance, and by powers greater than themselves. Their presence, once sufficient to unmake kingdoms, faltered before the resistance of the small, the weak, and the seemingly insignificant. They had become shadows of command, yet shadows cannot grasp what light protects. The hunt for the ring marked a turning in their long history. They were no longer distant myths haunting far lands. They had stepped into the heart of the world's struggle, and in stepping they had revealed both their strength and their limits. To the free peoples, their terror was confirmed. The Nazgûl were real, relentless, and nearly invincible. Yet to the wise, their weakness was also revealed. Their being was bound to the ring, and in that bond lay both their strength and their doom. Thus, their pursuit ended in failure, but not in conclusion. The ring still moved, and so long as it endured, so too would they. Yet the shadow of doubt had entered even their legend, for if inevitability itself could be resisted, what then awaited the Nine in the days to come? From the raging waters of Brulin the Nazgûl emerged, broken, their mounts drowned, their forms scattered. Yet not destroyed. They could not be destroyed, not while the ring endured, for their existence was tied to it more deeply than flesh to bone. They returned to Mordor in silence, drawn back to their master's will, their failure stinging yet not their own to grieve, for they had no grief that belonged to them anymore, only the hollow knowledge that what they pursued had slipped through their grasp. But Sauron's will did not falter, and his summons bound them once again, raising them from ruin and sending them back into the world with dread renewed. It was in this later rising that their power reached its darkest form. Clad in new terror, mounted on great-winged creatures bred of shadow and storm, they became more dreadful than before, their cries carrying across leagues of land. No longer confined to horses, they swept through the skies, descending upon cities and armies as omens of despair. It was then that they became inseparably bound to Minas Morgul, the fortress of death and sorcery, the citadel that gleamed pale against the mountains of shadow. Once it had been Minas Ithil, a tower of beauty and light, raised by men of Númenórean blood to guard the passes into Mordor. Now it was a corpse of a city, its stones corrupted, its fountains choked with darkness, its towers leaning as if in mockery of their former grace. And upon this throne of ruin the Witch King and his brethren set their dwelling. From Minas Morgul they rode forth in terror. The city itself seemed to breathe despair, its pale glow rising like corpse light into the night sky, visible for miles across the Ethel Duath. Those who gazed upon it too long felt unease seep into their bones, for the fortress was not merely stone but symbol, a living embodiment of corruption. The Nazgûl had made it their lair, and as they moved through its halls, no sound of life stirred, only the echoes of their cloaks brushing the cold floors, only the faint sigh of voices that were not their own. It was from this citadel that they poured forth when the Dark Lord's war burst into its final fury. As Gondor stood in peril, Minas Morgul emptied its legions. Orcs, trolls, and men enslaved by shadow spilled from its gates, and above them rode the Nazgûl, their cries cutting courage from the hearts of those who watched. The Witch King himself led the host, and the city trembled behind him as he passed. It was said that as the army departed, the mountain quaked, as if the land itself recoiled from the unholy tide. The light that glowed from Minas Morgul flared and dimmed, like a dying star, leaving the valley in a deathly pallor. Gondor knew then that the storm had come. The siege of Minas Tirith was not only a clash of armies, but of symbols. Two towers stood in opposition: Minas Morgul, the fortress of despair, and Minas Tirith, the tower of God, white and steadfast upon its hill. The Nazgûl carried the full weight of terror into the conflict. They circled the walls of Gondor's city, their winged beasts shrieking through the night, their own cries echoing through the stone, shaking the resolve of defenders. Fires burned, bells rang, but none could silence the dread that swept over the city like smoke. The soldiers upon the walls faltered, for who can raise sword when their hearts are pierced by fear deeper than death? The Witch King moved at the forefront, his presence magnified by prophecy, for it was spoken that no living man could kill him. This invincibility, whether in truth or illusion, added weight to his terror. His enemies looked upon him and saw not merely a foe but an inevitability, a figure who carried with him the certainty of their end. And inevitability, once believed, is harder to resist than armies. He strode through the battle like shadow made flesh, striking not only with blade but with despair, unmaking the courage of Gondor as swiftly as he broke its gates. Yet within Gondor, resistance did not wholly fail, for even terror has its limit, and despair can provoke defiance as well as surrender. When courage flickers in its lowest moment, it can burn brighter than before. Though the Nazgûl spread horror, though Minas Morgul's legions pressed their assault, Gondor's defenders endured longer than fear alone predicted. Hope remained, faint and fragile. Yet hope nonetheless, carried by unexpected hands and unforeseen allies. Still, the Nazgûl pressed their assault. Their power was tied to the ring, and the ring drew near its fate. As Frodo and Sam crept through Mordor toward the very fire of Orodruin, the Ringwraiths were bound more tightly than ever, their being sharpened into urgency. They scoured the lands, their cries echoing from the skies, their eyes searching for the treasure that defined their existence. Yet in their ceaseless pursuit lay the seed of their undoing, for their power was not truly their own. It was borrowed, leashed to the fate of the One Ring, and so long as it was beyond their grasp, they remained servants chasing shadows, unable to claim the object that gave them form. The fall of Minas Morgul was not marked by battle alone, but by the unraveling of the ring. For as the tide of war surged, as Gondor endured, as Rohan rode to its aid, the fate of the Nazgûl drew closer to the brink. Minas Morgul itself, for all its pale glow and dreadful power, stood only so long as the ring endured. Its light was a reflection, not a source, a symbol of a power that was not its own. When the end came, its towers would crumble as surely as the shadows that dwelled within. For now, though, its terror remained. Minas Morgul, fortress of wraiths, sent forth its legions to break Gondor, its gates vomiting darkness into the night, its masters circling in the sky above. The Nazgûl seemed unstoppable, their cries louder than ever, their shadows longer than before. Yet every step they took carried them nearer to the brink, for the fate of their master's ring was already trembling in the hands of those too small to be noticed by the Lords of Dread. If their power was bound entirely to another, what would become of them when that bond was severed? The end did not come as battle usually ends, with the clash of armies and the surrender of men, but as silence descending after a cry too long sustained. For the Nazgûl were not slain by swords, nor overcome by walls, nor toppled by kings. Their undoing was written into the very fabric of their existence. They were shadows bound to the fate of the ring, and when the ring was destroyed, so too was the power that held them. Their final hour was not of choice, nor of struggle, but of inevitability. They rode upon their winged steeds in those last moments, sweeping across the slopes of Orodruin, shrieking in dreadful fury as Frodo stood upon the brink of the fire. Their cries split the sky, piercing every heart in the plain below, for they knew the ring was there, and they hungered for it with all the hunger of centuries. Their very forms seemed to stretch toward it, bound by compulsion deeper than thought. In those final instants they were closer to their prize than they had ever been. Yet closeness was not possession. Even as their shrieks reached their highest pitch, the ring fell into the fire, and its unmaking was the unmaking of them. The moment it was consumed, their bond snapped. There was no wound to bind, no prison to break, no chain to tear away. They had been sustained entirely by the ring's existence, and with it gone, there was nothing left to hold them. Their cries turned from fury to silence in a single breath. The winged beasts upon which they rode faltered and fell, and the cloaked shadows dissolved into the air like smoke scattered by the wind. No graves marked their passing, no monuments bore their names. They simply ceased, unmade as thoroughly as if they had never been. For all their centuries of terror, their end was abrupt, almost quiet, as though the world itself sighed in relief. Where they had once spread dread like fire, the wind now carried only emptiness. Their silence was not absence alone, but the ending of a long echo. They had lived as hollows, bound to another's will, and when that will was broken, their hollowness could not endure. Thus they were erased, not slain, not defeated, but erased as shadows vanish when the light they depend on is extinguished. And yet, in their erasure, lay a kind of revelation, for their story had never been about dominion, nor about conquest, nor even about terror. It was about desire's cost. The Nine had once been men, kings who sought power, endurance, permanence. They had accepted rings, believing they could master them, believing they could hold eternity in their hands, but eternity held them instead, stripping them first of flesh, then of voice, then of self, until nothing remained but shadows of obedience. Their fate was sealed not by cruelty alone, but by their own hunger, which had made them vulnerable to the promise of gifts, too great to refuse. Theirs was the tragedy of ambition unchecked, of power sought without wisdom, of mortality denied at too high a price. In the quiet after their fall, one can imagine the echo of what they might have thought had thought remained to them. Perhaps they recalled their crowns, their lands, their people, now dust long centuries past. Perhaps they felt the final ache of having lived so long, and yet not truly lived at all. Or perhaps nothing remained, only silence, unbroken, final. For what endures when the very essence of one's being has been bound to another, and that bond is cut? The world, though scarred by their passing, found in their end a lesson. Fear is mighty, but it is not invincible. Terror can unmake armies, but it cannot endure against hope. Power borrowed is power lost when its source is undone. The Nine had seemed eternal, inevitable, unstoppable. Yet they were none of these things. They were reflections, not substance, echoes, not voices. And when the ring was destroyed, the echo ceased. Thus the Nazgûl passed from the world, leaving behind only memory and warning. To those who had faced them, they remained as phantoms in recollection, cries that lingered in the mind long after silence returned to history. They stood as monuments to the peril of unchecked desire, examples of how the promise of immortality may be the most certain path to oblivion. And to those who pondered the deeper mysteries of Middle-earth, their fate spoke of a truth older than any kingdom, that to surrender one's will is to surrender one's being, and that nothing, not even power, is worth such surrender. Their silence was profound. It was not the silence of rest, nor of peace, but of erasure. No afterlife awaited them, no halls of kings, no remembrance in songs of valor. They were not mourned, for none loved them. They were not cursed further, for their curse had ended with their unmaking. They were simply gone, dissolved into the void from which they could never return. This was the ultimate cost, not death, but the obliteration of identity, the loss so complete that nothing remained to speak of what once had been. And yet, their story endures, retold in shadowed words and whispered legends, for though they are gone, the lesson of their fall remains. Power, that corrupts is not power at all. It is bondage disguised as gift. To seek it without restraint is to open the door to shadow. And once the shadow enters, it does not easily leave. The Nazgûl are remembered not as kings, not as conquerors, not even as wraiths, but as warnings. Their silence is the echo that continues, reminding all who listen that the pursuit of dominion without wisdom leads only to ruin. So ended the Nine, the Ringwraiths, the Nazgûl, not with the roar of triumph, nor with the glory of lasting empire, but with the fading of shadows at dawn. The crowns they once wore are long lost. The names they bore are long forgotten. Their thrones are dust, their fortresses ruins, their deeds remembered only as terrors long past. They sought immortality and found only nothingness. They sought dominion and found only servitude. They sought to endure, and in the end they endured only as silence. The tale of the Nazgûl closes not with battle cries, but with absence. And in that absence lies the most enduring truth, that the greatest shadow is not destruction, but the loss of self. Their silence after shadow is the lesson left behind, the quiet warning that echoes still through the ages of Middle-earth. In the long silence that followed their unmaking, the world began to breathe again. The Nazgûl were gone, swept away in the collapse of the ring's power, yet their absence was not the sudden vanishing of a storm, but the slow dawning of a day long delayed. Men lifted their eyes without dread of shadows sweeping the sky. Horses no longer shrieked at unseen terrors, and the valleys near Mordor no longer trembled beneath the cries of the Nine. Still, the memory of them lingered like smoke after fire, clinging to the corners of the heart. For though they were erased utterly, the shadow they had cast across ages could not be banished in a single moment. It lived on in story, in warning, in the haunted stillness that followed their passing. In the White City, where bells rang once more in triumph, men spoke of the Witch King's fall. They remembered the moment when prophecy broke upon the field of battle, when the immortal servant was undone not by power greater than his own, but by a hand long overlooked. A woman and a hobbit struck the blows that ended his terror, and in that ending lay a truth deeper than prophecy itself, that no shadow, however inevitable it may seem, is beyond the reach of the smallest light. Thus, in taverns and in halls, in villages and in courts, the tale of his defeat became a reminder that despair is never final. Yet, the Nazgûl were not only figures of terror to be defeated, they were also warnings carved into the memory of the world. They had once been men, noble kings, whose names had commanded loyalty and reverence. They had accepted gifts that seemed to promise eternity, and in doing so, had traded away the very essence of their being. Their crowns became shadows, their voices echoes, their wills extensions of another's design. And when the ring was destroyed, nothing of them remained, not even the faintest whisper of a soul. Their fate was not death, but erasure. To many, this was more fearful than death itself, for it spoke of a loss so complete that no afterlife, no remembrance, no redemption could follow. The lands they touched bore scars long after their passing. In the north, the ruins of Angmar stood as silent testimony to the Witch King's empire of fear. In Gondor, the valley of Minas Morgul lay poisoned, its stones glowing faintly as though the memory of corruption still lingered in the earth. Travelers shunned the place, for though the wraiths were gone, the shadow of their dwelling clung to the air, heavy and unclean, and in quiet corners of the world, elders still hushed children with tales of the Nine Riders, teaching them that desire for power may turn even kings into shadows. But within the memory of their ruin, a deeper reflection stirred. The story of the Nazgûl was not simply the tale of evil triumphing over the weak, nor of despair overwhelming hope. It was also the tale of mortality misunderstood, for the kings who became wraiths had feared death, had sought to escape its bounds. They had desired permanence, crowns that would never fall, lives that would never end. Yet in reaching beyond the gift of men, they found only bondage. They endured, yes, but endured as emptiness, unending yet unalive. Their silence after the ring's fall was the final confirmation. Immortality without freedom is not life, but void. So the wise remembered. In Rivendell, where songs were sung of victories and losses, the elves spoke softly of the Nazgûl, not in hatred, but in pity, for they knew the weight of long years, and they understood how easily the longing for permanence could twist into shadow. Among men the tale spread as caution. No gift is free, no promise of eternity comes without cost. Better to live a fleeting life with freedom than an endless one in chains. Better to embrace mortality than to endure hollow eternity. Thus their story became a mirror, showing each generation the peril of unchecked desire. And yet, for all their terror, the Nazgûl was strangely fragile. Their strength had been vast, but it was never their own. They had been feared as inevitability, yet inevitability itself was undone by the courage of the small and the faith of the steadfast. Their very being depended on the ring, and when the ring was gone, they vanished as shadows vanish at sunrise. In this fragility lay the comfort that evil, however strong it may seem, is always bound by something deeper. No shadow is eternal, no terror beyond the reach of ending. Even the nine, who had once seemed beyond defeat, were revealed in the end to be nothing more than hollow vessels, dependent on a power that could not last. For those who lived after, the memory of the Nazgûl lingered not as despair, but as lesson. They taught that to surrender will is to surrender self, and that no power, however tempting, is worth the price of one's soul. They taught that fear may conquer kingdoms, but it cannot plant hope, and that hope is the stronger foundation. They taught that even the smallest hand, unnoticed by kings and unseen by armies, may turn the tide against inevitability. And above all, they taught that silence follows shadow, not as rest, but as warning. So their story closed, not in triumph, nor in mourning, but in reflection. They were gone, and the world endured. Their absence became as important as their presence had been. For in their absence men learned what it means to resist and what it costs to yield. The nine were remembered not as rulers, not as victors, but as emptiness, a void where kings had once stood. They were the silence left when desire devours itself. Thus ends the tale of the Nazgûl. Kings who sought to master time, only to be mastered by it. Men who reached for eternity, only to dissolve into nothingness. Their cries once split the sky, but now only silence remains. And in that silence lies the final truth, that the greatest power is not in rings, nor in shadows, but in the freedom to remain oneself even unto the end.